Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee with Comrades, a podcast discussing current events, theory, and action through a radical lens. Hey y'all, welcome back to another edition of Coffee with Comrades. I finally got to sit down with my friend and comrade Sydney Milstein this week and talk about her new book, Deciding for Ourselves, The Promise of Direct Democracy. I can't wait to share the dialogue with you, but first, a couple quick announcements. As longtime listeners of this program are no doubt well aware by this point, Coffee with Comrades is a proud member of the Rev Left Radio Federation and the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. Check out this jingle from our CZN Spotlight of the Month, Margaret Killjoy.
Hello, and welcome to We Will Remember Freedom, a monthly podcast of anarchist fiction. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to Live Like the World is Dying, your podcast for what feels like the end times. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to the jingle for both of my podcasts. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. You can find my podcasts wherever you get your podcasts or get them from the Channel Zero network.
Margaret has not one, but two different programs on the Channel Zero network, and let me just tell you, both are super fucking awesome. The first, We Will Remember Freedom, is a podcast that spotlights the fictional work and narrative storytelling of science fiction and speculative fiction writers, especially those written by queer folks and people of color. The second podcast Margaret hosts is called Live Like the World is Dying, which could sort of be described as a anarchic preppers podcast. In each episode, Margaret asks the question, how do we live in a world that might be ending? The answer? By preparing to survive that end and by working to prevent it. You can check out both of Margaret Killjoy's stellar shows wherever you get your podcasts. Last but certainly not least, I wanted to be sure to plug the courageous efforts of Gainesville IWOC, Fight Toxic Prisons, and Capital City Mutual Aid in the fight against Florida's incarceral system. This week, there were a number of demonstrations that escalated into a barricade being erected in front of the governor's mansion here in Tallahassee. Two of my comrades were arrested in the midst of this daring and creative protest, and while fortunately both have since been freed and are in good health and high spirits, both still face legal challenges in the weeks and months ahead. I know that times are tough for folks right now, but if you are willing and able, please consider donating to help them fight off the carceral state and to defend themselves with good legal representation. You can find links to donate in the show notes, or you can just donate directly to fighttoxicprisons@gmail.com on PayPal or on Cash App at $FightToxicPrisons. Alright, with that said and done, let's get to today's discussion. Without further ado, I am pleased to present episode 82 of Coffee with Comrades, Messy Beautiful, featuring Sydney Milstein.
There's no justice for the ones who
This week I am joined by my comrade and my friend Cindy Milstein to chat about her brand new edited anthology, Deciding for Ourselves, The Promise of Direct Democracy. Cindy, welcome on Coffee with Comrades, my friend.
Thank you for having me on. I'm so excited to be on your show at long last.
Yeah, me too. This has obviously been a long time coming, and I am thrilled, like I was saying earlier, that, it can mark the occasion of this auspicious new anthology. But for folks who, may not already be aware of your work, Cindy, could you maybe briefly introduce yourself and explain how you got into anarchist and radical politics?
Sure. I'm not sure. I feel like my earliest memory was of being interested in thinking about the world through a political lens. Like that's some of my earliest memories, but I think that comes from a cultural Judaism that was encouraging from the beginning to try to do good in the world. But then I went through like a lot of people, different, what does that look like? So different transformations. And I think finally I met anarchists and it was like a light bulb going off, being like, oh, this is what I've always wanted or understood and that included Murray Bookchin. So I just feel really fortunate. That's sort of who I ran into, who's like a lifelong radical.
And the book is actually dedicated to him.
Yeah, well, yeah, he was like a mentor and a friend and someone who's really fun to argue with because we're both Jewish. We like to argue.
Yeah, he definitely seemed like a polemic fellow, so I can see how that would be fun to argue with.
But it's okay. I feel like culturally for me that actually feels comfortable. But right. I mean, he was like, I really appreciate he also like from his earliest memory was born into a radical milieu much more than I was, and spent his whole life as a radical. And I just feel like that I really respect people that do that commit to this kind of politics for life and he was very powerful in that in terms of being like, this is serious, commit to it for life. And here's what you need to do. And so I think in a way, what he mentored me in a lot of ways was to think about like the commitment to, organizing, agitating and educating, and being out in the world through writing and speaking and actually being involved in things so that when you're writing and speaking, you're part of it, not outside it. And but I think the reason anarchism spoke to me and to relate it to what I've done since is I've always been interested in a politics that includes everyone. I don't know why that was always like I don't understand why everyone doesn't get to decide everything together. That's always, for my earliest memories, been really important to me. And so I've done a lot over the past years I do a lot of grassroots organizing with an emphasis on prefigurative politics, which is like doing what you want now that gestures toward the future you want. And a lot of that's involved creating spaces that are collective, self-organized, that, again, prefigure a different world. And one of the most current ones, which sadly are being canceled due to the COVID disaster, is an anarchist summer school called the Institute for Advanced Troublemaking, which hopefully will continue on, which is a magical space, and happens in the summer. And I've been part of organizing the Montreal Anarchist Book Fair, which we're trying to do something different, but the physical book fair has to be canceled. So those are just examples. And I lately have been doing a lot of like behind the scenes sort of mutual aid work, connecting folks. I've been putting together basically a directory of mutual aid projects, hundreds of them at this point. I've been doing that for the last month, called Collective Care is Our Best Weapon Against COVID-19. And it's just I add every day ones. So that's been really inspiring. And I also do books and write. So this is one of the latest, this anthology, which includes other voices besides myself. And I've done other writing and book projects. So
yeah, and you and I actually first had the good fortune of linking up at like a radical book fair. You and I met first in Atlanta and got to share on a panel about mutual aid and disaster relief. And one of the things that I've admired kind of from afar until we actually got to meet was kind of the way that your work always invites people to become really active participants in the projects that you're doing. And I kind of got to witness this firsthand when we were in Atlanta together, because you asked me if it would be all right if we sat on the edge of the stage rather than like standing up or sitting on chairs that they had set aside for us, and just like kind of be with the audience and really commune with people on a more interpersonal level. And over the years of reading your work, especially Rebellious Morning, which is another edited anthology you put out with AK Press, I've always really been struck by the people that you seem to bring into your orbit. And so I was wondering if here at the top, maybe you could talk a little bit about what the process was like for deciding for ourselves together, right? Like, how did you select these various contributors for this collection? How did you all find each other? That sort of thing.
Yeah. No, that is, to me, it's I try really hard to like practice how do we actually reconfigure space, whether it's in a book or in real life, to create more caring, reciprocal, dialogic relationships. And I like kind of connecting people on big pictures. So to me, that deciding for ourselves, I don't know, when it kind of ended up, I really wanted to focus on contemporary examples today that were living examples that had lived a long time or were large scale. Not much as I love like directly democratic, bookstore, let's say, radical bookstore. I was trying to show that with this, that it's possible to do it on a scale of a city, a neighborhood, a region. And so the way this came together was basically like this beautiful treasure hunt, and the treasure was looking for possibility and promise. And it really was, though. I just started wandering around through various people I know and connections, trying to find people. I really wanted a kind of a global perspective, because some of the most inspiring examples are not, I think there's actually, I'm trying to think, is there anything in there in the so-called United States? And I think not. Almost all yeah. Except when I talk about Occupy, all the examples are other places. But then that was an interesting process. That took a long time, because there's a piece on a project that's been going for 11 years now in France. And originally I wanted to get someone to write about the ZAD, which is a project where people took over a huge region in protest of an airport being built, and that turned into its whole own self sort of organized autonomous village region. But I couldn't find anyone there, and I went through multiple people at that, and then ended up someone finally saying, hey, the project you should really look at is in Dijon. So that project, I think I went through 12 people till I found someone who was both was part of it. I wanted people who personally engaged.
Right, not just like somebody who like flew in for like a flyby kind of thing, or like a reporter or a journalist, but somebody who had like lived there and experienced it.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for. People could speak from the heart, from being there, from being part of it, and also that they were good writers and good thinkers. And unfortunately, because of my limited capacity and because the book was going to be in English, it ultimately needed to be in English.
Right.
And almost all the pieces were, the person's first language was not English, so that was a whole nother level of editing that I've never experienced before. It took a lot longer. It was also a beautiful process of translating. Sure. But yeah, so that was the process, and I wanted ones that were feminist in a certain, or brought about, had a really strong sensibility of people actually caring for and loving for each other in ways that you don't, this. So I really wanted examples that held that, but yeah, it was a beautiful process for me, because I met so many people trying to find places, and people giving me recommendations. And I really wanted, again, a piece on Chiapas, the Zapatistas. That seems like an obvious one. I could not find someone to write about that because of language, but also because of this really strong commitment there to not speak through the individual. Like, everyone that I asked was ultimately like, I don't know, if I say something, other people aren't going to like it. We're really committed to having a voice that people, it takes. And so even that was such a beautiful experience to realize that the deep, deep commitment different places have when they structure direct democracy to the sense of a communal voice, a communal space, a communal creation. But yeah, that's a long sort of way of round of how I ended up finding people. And then through that, I think each piece went through back and forth like 8 or 10 times.
Oh my gosh.
Because they're long pieces. There was a translation issues. There was just, I wanted more detail, or rearranging, or all these other things. And so I think I really like that beautiful collaborative process of collaboratively editing with people, where you also get to know why they're writing something and what they're passionate, what they care about. And so I feel like partially what you don't see when you read a book is that there's the process itself is this deciding for ourselves how we want it to look, including the people inside it. And the last thing was I really wanted pieces that were from really different contexts and different. One of the critiques of direct democracy is it only works when, when people are homogeneous or in specific types of places. Often people point to like, oh, it'll only work if you have like, middle-class white people or whatever the example is. And I really wanted to show that this is something that's, I hate to use the word right. That's a funny word, but this ethically makes sense, allows for a qualitativeness of life, no matter who you are. And so the piece is really, there's, whether you're through the Pan-African tradition or indigenous or feminist or live in a so-called Western country or a so-called, country, south of the U.S. border, all these things, how all these places in the middle of a giant city in a rural space. I really wanted to show the diversity of contexts that allow for this beautiful promise.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I was really interested by, and I want to get there here in just a second. But before we do, I'm also kind of curious because, this might seem like an obvious question to you and me, but I think that, for the sake of the conversation, because I do think it's a little bit more complicated. What is direct democracy exactly? Like, where did this term come from, and what maybe distinguishes it from the liberal democracies of places like the so-called U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just answer this one briefly because this has filled volumes of books. But to me, a lot of people, sort of historians, will look back to ancient Greece when when it was a city-state before the rise of nation-states, and there was a pretty well-articulated version of a direct democracy, which involved, unfortunately, a small minority of the population, which was male, not females, not the slaves at that time, and so, you don't want to romanticize it. But the word democracy comes from the root of demos, which is Greek. So the idea that it means the rule of all or the rule of the many. But I would say, it is mostly democracy or the rule of the many or direct democracy has mostly been demonized and fought against. And to my mind, it's something that has always existed throughout human history as a practice. It's not something that the ancient Greeks invented. They were also practicing one version of it, which had beautiful parts to it and flawed parts. The reason that survived is because they wrote it down literally on stone tablets. They etched out a lot of their agreements, and so literally it's in museums. You can go and visit. It's very the memory of it is intact. But I would say it's a practice, like people just turning to each other and saying, "Hey, we all want to figure out together what affects us." So my short definition would be direct democracy is when we all sort of look at each other, turn to each other, and go, "Hey, we all together can decide together the ultimate decisions that affect all our lives, and that nobody is more important than anyone else. We have different skills and different passions and different, interests, but ultimately we all should be able to determine the life of our community to each other, which doesn't mean we all get our way all the time, but that nobody has more power than anyone else to impose what life will look like, that we all have the ability to work on that together." And when you were saying the liberal democracies of places like the United States, that I would call, in a way, terms become confusing here, but the use of democracy there is highly inaccurate. Those places were all started as republics.
For sure.
So or what we would call representative parliamentary systems, where they understood they wanted a top leader instead of a king. They wanted a president instead of a monarch. It was a very move toward nation states. And there was a huge battle we can look at just what has been called the American Revolution. There was the fight to kick the British out, to kick the sort of imperialist monarch power out of this continent. And then after that, there was a huge struggle between the, quote unquote revolutionaries about what structure of governance would be put in place. And there was a huge amount of direct democracy going on at that time period, which is largely what won that revolution. Militias, which are often self-organized, and people vote for their leaders, town meetings. In many places, people had them every week and were determining the whole life of their communities. And there was a whole bunch of constitution making where all these little places wanted to have their own ways of determining how things went. And there was a battle to create one constitution, one president, one federal government, and call it a democracy when it's highly inaccurate, I would say.
Totally.
But fine. I would really counterpose it now with what we have is at best a representative form of democracy. I hate to use that term there. And direct, unfortunately, has had to be put in front of democracy to explain that no, when everyone decides together, they do it together directly. They're not looking for a president or a Congress or someone to mediate their decision making. Yeah, I think humans do that. You see that all the time, and right now we're seeing it. There's a large scale collective disaster going on globally, and in almost all these disasters, states and capital and colonialism and all these other hierarchical structures basically abandon people, and people look at each other and go, hey, what are we going to do? How are we going to get masks into emergency rooms? Because people are dying and they're not being supplied by the state and capital. And people start self-organizing and making their own decisions about how they're going to do that. And I just think it's a human impulse. Who wants to not be part of making decisions about their own life with each other? Right?
Yeah, totally. Well, and it's interesting too because I think you're absolutely right about the correction to the term liberal democracy. It is a representative republic and the sort of constitutional sense of the term. But I'm also kind of curious. I find myself oftentimes describing anarchy and anarchism as the most democratic form of social organizing to people who aren't really steeped in sort of left theory, so to speak, as a kind of a way to onboard folks into popular movements and to onboard people into community organizing, is explaining it as the most extreme or the most radical form of democracy. Do you think that's a useful term? Do you think that direct democracy is a fundamental aspect of anarchism? Is it something adjacent to anarchism? Is it a tactic or a strategy that anarchists use? I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, anarchists will debate this, but I think ultimately anarchism is about self-organization and self-determination. And the most fundamental part about that is actually who gets to decide.
Right.
You can self-organize, whatever. Again, I'll use a food co-op. But if there's one person that gets to go, nope, we're doing it this way, all your self-organization makes no sense. So implicit in anarchism, if you have the idea of self-organization, anarchists, fine, will debate whether they like the term direct democracy or not. And again, because the United States and other countries like it call themselves democracies, is that term useful or not? That's might be an interesting argument in terms of linguistics or terminology. To my mind, what's more important is this capacity to decide for ourselves, which is why that term seems maybe clearer, or self-governance might be another word for it, or, when there's no one mediating between the decisions that affect us. Other people have looked at council traditions or assembly traditions. Again, the language to me is less important than the practice, which I think is why I really want to do this anthology, is to not have a bunch of theory about we can debate which term makes sense and whether or not historically. But what are people doing right now that their lives aren't perfect? There's no perfect structure to have social organization. But qualitatively, each example, life is so much better for people, and they're determining their own lives together in ways that make it better because they get to determine that. So to me, yes, of course, that's equivalent. I'm an anarchist. That is, you can't have anarchism, to my mind, without the ability to decide for ourselves. That seems completely crucial to anarchism. And I agree with you. I like understanding. I mean, another way, I mentioned Murray Bookchin at the beginning. He would often say this, and I agree that sort of the highest form of direct action, there's direct action to shut things down that we don't like. But to me, the direct actions I like are ones that open up space for what we want. And so the highest form of anarchism, the highest form of direct action under anarchism would be when we open up space to determine the world together for ourselves based on a lot of other anarchist values, which is why I still think anarchism is so important, because it's a constellation of values of, reciprocity and mutual aid and solidarity and dignity and love and, voluntary association. But all those things have to be coupled together, or feminism, all these things. But then fine, you look at the Zapatistas, they're not particularly interested in those labels. They're interested in a deep level of solidarity. In this book, Deciding for Ourselves, you could read some of the projects and go, hey, that person writing it might not be an anarchist. Everyone involved in it certainly isn't an anarchist. But the qualitativeness of it, I would call anarchistic. So
Yeah, no, totally. And, that was one of the things, like I said earlier, it really fascinated me about this collection because, I always find myself, again, with my more, conservative or apolitical friends trying to, give concrete examples, right, of anarchism in action, or of anarchic-like forms of association in action, of direct democracy in action. And that's the thing that I really, really value and prize about this book, is that you found places where it's like actually happening, right? And then encouraged people who had that specific insight into how direct democracy functions in their place in space, write about it and share it with other people. And I think that, it's fair to say, and this edited anthology that you've created really illustrates that direct democracy is unique and original to each of the places that it crops up, whether it's in Rojava or in Zapatista territory, in Sharon or in Denmark or Greece. And I was wondering, like, why did you think that it was important to focus on this facet of success, of this idea of really being rooted in the place, in the space, in the time of each specific democratic project?
Yeah, I think it's like any, if we go to the non-human world, there's all sorts of different ecosystems that are distinct, and the differences within those ecosystems coexist in a harmony that allows the ecosystem to not only survive but thrive. And why would we think human organization needs to be any different? We're part of nature. We're just one part of nature, right? So each of these communities is their own ecosystem. And if we're really serious about that, really profoundly serious to me, taking anarchism seriously is not having the right answer for everybody. It's saying, here's a set of beautiful ethics. I want to see how you play with them, how you implement them, how you make them fit for your life. I don't need to tell you how to do that. That's a monarch or a dictator or, a Congress. And so I think the deep commitment to me, I really wanted to show, some of the examples. If I had to pick which one I would want to live in, if I could choose just between the ones that end up being in this anthology, different ones will speak to different people. And yet none of them completely speak to me either, because they're not part of the ecosystem that I'm part of, right? So what would it be if I were with every, where I am to make it? And what I appreciate about them all is they're really taking seriously, if we're going to decide for ourselves, that involves the context. So Rojava, for instance, right? The context, Kurds being targeted for disappearance and genocide for many decades, if not 100 years or so, right? Not being forced to be diasporic, being in a war zone, and also being attacked by fascistic forces. All those things seem to make it impossible to do this grand experiment in a feminist, self-governed space region of up to 3 million people. And yet, for I think it's going on 7 years now, they're still there. And so it only works because they're borrowing on their what's in their culture to borrow on. So another good example in the book is Chiran, which I may be mispronouncing, which is in Mexico. It's a community that about 10 years ago got fed up with loggers who were coming into this community, and a few women just decided to block the logging trucks one morning, and with bonfires, and then bonfires spread all over the community. And around the bonfires, while they actually were holding off the logging company, they just started talking to each other, and they're like, hey, this isn't what we want our world to look like. And they ultimately end up kicking out all the politicians, all the police, and the logging company from their community. And they have this really deeply articulated structure. And the structure itself comes from their own indigenous traditions that go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. If you read it and try to just implement that structure somewhere else, it wouldn't click, it wouldn't work, it wouldn't make sense. It deeply works there because it's already part of the fabric of the culture there. And so I think also us to understand that you just don't go impose a direct democracy and then think it's going to work, or you don't, there's been some other sort of anarchist critiques of direct democracy that have been like, every direct democracy just turns into a state. It's still authoritarianism, blah, blah, blah. And it's almost like they're creating this straw argument, because at the heart of their argument is that it's sort of like there's the direct democracy. And to me,
like as a singular form.
Yeah. And so this is showing, no, people self-organize around what makes sense to get something done where they live.
Right. Direct democracies rather than direct democracy.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. Forms of self-governance, forms of self-organization, not the self-organization.
Totally.
And I think what also I really want to show is that in each case, the reason you need to do that is because people have different needs, different desires, different dilemmas, and different joys. And so what do they want to accentuate? And the last thing I want to say about this, that I think a book that I really love in certain ways, or his work I love in general in certain ways, not have critiques of it, but is an anarchist anthropologist named James C. Scott wrote a book called Seeing Like the State. And one of his core arguments in that is that the state emerged as a form of control, social control. But the way it did that was to make all these unique ecosystems of how people self-organize their lives into legible, controllable, straight line, documentable, named places. And so part of direct democracy, C's in plural, is when people make things that are legible to themselves, understandable to themselves, that work to themselves. They don't need to explain it to anyone else because they understand it, but also not explaining it to anyone else is part of the protection of keeping it. If that makes sense. So James C. Scott, one of his examples, he has all these really interesting illustrations. One of his examples is a lot of people used to grow food really haphazardly. Some of it would be cultivated, some of it would be things that were already growing. Nobody really owned land. So he has all these pictures of how in different places it looked almost incomprehensible about where people got their food if you had a bird's eye view of where it was growing above. And when the state came in, it divided up land, created ownership papers, created squares, boundaries, fences, taxes, all these things to make legible who suddenly owned a piece of land, what was being grown there, how the state could make money off it, control it. And it needed to make, let's say, just food growing legible, right, in order to control people. Whereas before, people were actually probably eating almost maybe even better, or they were eating in a way that made sense to what they could grow, where they lived, and they didn't really care, in most cases, who owned it, as long as they had some method of making sure everybody had enough to eat. So, so I don't know. I think part of it is to show that, again, this deep commitment to everybody everywhere deserves to have their needs and desires and joys met, and deserves to figure out how to deal with the dilemmas they face wherever they live.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting, too, that you write about, or rather, it's interesting, too, that you talk about joy and how it animates so much of direct democracy. The older I get, the more I kind of fixate on the idea of joy. And I was particularly struck because of kind of the dynamism and the varied approaches that people took within this anthology. I mean, you have interview transcripts, you have very narrative based, kind of storytelling, you have more like personal essay styles, but then you also have poetry. And as a poet, one of the things that I really loved about Deciding for Ourselves is how you frame it, because the entire anthology starts and ends with your poetry, Cindy. And I was wondering if you could maybe explain what went into that decision of kind of framing the opening and closing of a, political anthology of essays with poetry. Like what about poetry prefigured the way that you wanted people to start looking at this anthology and end looking at this anthology?
Yeah, it's funny. I do not think I write poetry. I didn't even think about that as poetry until you said that. I wrote a piece called Deciding for Ourselves, maybe 8 years ago or so, for a collaborative experimental project that I did with Eric Ruin, who does amazing, really intricate art with often cutting out, like actually cut out art. And then would prints it. But we did this thing where we made sort of picture prose poems, and it was called Paths Toward Utopia, a graphic exploration of everyday anarchism. It's on PM Press, and I actually loved the book. And it was an experiment for us because we were like, how can we do words and pictures where by themselves, like they're more when they're together, and the two, neither of them have to say the whole thing. And so for me, it was an interesting challenge because usually I write was like, okay, the writing has to say everything that I want it to say. And in this, and then it almost forced me to write more poetically. And so it was really an interesting like challenge for me. And yeah, that book I think is actually even more relevant today. It looks at everyday practices, everyday anarchism in the title, which was sort of a pun, a play. I like play on its own words. Is how can we make anarchism how people live their lives every day, which is what Deciding for Ourselves, the book, is about. Is like, who cares what you call it, but people are living out what I would understand anarchism to be, which is a free society of free people. And but how can we make it every day? Every day also means just routine and normal and not something you'd even think about. You wouldn't go, oh, that's strange. You would just be like, this is what we live under, right? And so have that be, instead of, we just live under a state. We just live under capitalism. That seems, quote, normal. Right now people are questioning that, which is great. But so this book we did was an experiment. And when I was doing the anthology, at one point I was trying to figure out the title. It was just like, whenever you do titles, you have to like search to be sure no one's else. And I was like, wait, I actually wrote a piece called that before, which is silly. And I reread it. And I mean, I knew I had, and then I thought, wow, the piece by itself, I feel like just is a nice frame. And then there was another piece I took from that project, because the pieces Eric hand lettered them in the art. So, which is a whole another way of reading them. And yeah, I just felt like they made a nice, I wanted a bookends for the piece. I really curate books more than edit them. I like thinking about how they flow, and to me, it's like a work of art for me, editing. And so I wanted to come into it with a sense of promise and go out of it with a sense of promise. And the sort of poetic piece that ends talks about when a beautiful space of direct democracy and self-governance and self-organization emerges almost spontaneously, though not overnight. I was looking at Egypt, and then how brutally it gets crushed, and yet how those legacies get carried on in other people's forms of freedom in the future, which isn't to say that I want things to get crushed. I don't. And I'm not trying to put, silver lining. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's horrible. I grieve when these spaces get crushed. It's horrible. People die. They're brutal. People suffer. It's horrible. And we have to carry that rebel spirit in our bones. We have to feel our ancestors in us who fought for those before, and we have to know we're being charged with fighting for them now, and that other people will fight for them in the future. So I really wanted those poetic space to hold that magic and that, for lack of a better term, because I'm not religious, but a leap of faith that we're part of a continuity, that even if this will never be the whole of the world, there are throughout history these profoundly beautiful spaces of autonomy and freedom and dignity and love and care. And they exist, and they have existed, and they can exist. And so to me, poetry, I looked up the definition of poetry because you had mentioned to me you might talk about this. And it's funny because it really provoked me because I don't really think of myself as a poet. And like poetry is about capturing the imagination and the emotional quality, and it's a holder of beauty. And I felt like that's what I wanted this book to be. Even I use the term a lot, things are messy, beautiful. Beauty doesn't mean this picture perfect. Like when we say beauty in the so-called US capitalistic context, we have this horrible image pop to our mind of some, certain type of, let's say, body image pops up into our mind. And that's not what I mean by beauty. So I mean the beauty of who we are inside and what we can create together in this world. And that's also messy, like everything is. But it's a lot less messy than what's happening, let's say, right now under the state, right now, in terms of allowing so many people to die because it doesn't care about the health of and welfare of the common good right now, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I wanted poetry to be this magical carrier of possibility and of promise.
Yeah. And it really is. I mean, like, it's funny on many occasions, having read your work, I'll just like tear up because of like the bittersweetness of it, right? The sort of existential reality of the pain and the suffering, but also the like kernel of joy that can grow into a conflagration. And I think that there's something about the idea of imagination starting and ending this anthology of things that are actually happening that really encourages the reader to begin to engage on a more personal and also like social level, thinking about, okay, so this is what it's like happening in this particular region of the world, whether it's in Mexico or in Denmark or in Greece, right? And okay, so that's great. So what does it look like for me now to put that into practice where I'm at? And I think that the idea of the poetry, starting and closing it, really instigates and catalyzes a sense of desire and curiosity and experimentation. And I think that I thought it was the perfect framing device. And so I was going to be remiss if I didn't ask you about it.
Oh, good. That was an experiment. I mean, for me, I'm also about like if everything needs to be experimental. And right now we're being, forced into this bizarre new, like, I really think we're not going to go back. A line has been crossed a month and a half or so ago into this, whatever the world is going to become, when, most people now don't have a job and won't be able to pay rent and are going to have so many losses and, and are so isolated, all these things where we have to push ourselves to imagine more than ever what we want the world to look like now, because we're being handed this. There's going to be a power vacuum happening when everything starts shifting and realigning, and the fascists are moving in with their imagination, and I don't like theirs. It will kill most of us, and capitalism in the state has already been doing that, as has white supremacy and patriarchy, and so I really think we need to have these kind of be really imaginative right now in the ways we're thinking about how we can, like, both protest and prefigure, and imaginative in the mutual aid projects we're doing, and imaginative in terms of how could these form a web to create something different. So I really want this book to be a gift, to be like, here's this challenge we all are holding. It's a huge, I take this as a huge responsibility, a collective responsibility now, because we're all in this moment collectively of us globally, collectively trying to figure out how to create more and more spaces of autonomy right now. And, I hope these spaces do offer that poetic leap of you can do it. I mean, to me, that's a lot of what I try to do in my work. It's like, whether it's in person or in writing or whatever, is to be like, it's not about me, it's about you. I want you to feel your own power so I can feel my power. So we all have powers. We all have magical gifts. We, how can we, and together they make for, every time I've been involved in something, it's been a process of, for lack of a better word, direct democracy. The answers always come out better because there's always like tons of answers, not one. And we always change the questions while we're thinking about it. And so it's like everybody has such beautiful things they could offer. So yeah, I really wanted that. And also I think more and more, I think telling stories is super powerful. It's like, I don't know, we're so cut off from really seeing and hearing each other. And when people speak out of the genuine passion for their world. So, I think to some degree, both the sort of poetic pieces I used are both about real world examples, and then sort of my my experiencing of them, and in trying to put together an anthology to show how things are prefigured in the everyday. But to some degree, they're my magical imaginings about how, and so, my own experimentation with how I would want the world to be. And we all need to do that, dream a lot more. And to come back to joy and sorrow, I don't know. I just think we have this there's so much I hate about this place called the United States, from its hyper individualism to this idea you either have to be happy or be sad. There's no in between, and I don't understand. That makes no sense to me. Like our most profound moments of joy have sorrow in them too. Our most, and vice versa. I don't know. I did that anthology about grief and loss, rebellious mourning, the collective work of grief, and have gone through watching people die and helping them die. And it's horrifically awful when you lose someone you love to death. And yet you feel more love than maybe you've ever felt. And you laugh harder than you ever have. And you cry in good ways than you ever had. And you feel connected to them and the world. And you don't want those people to die, but humans die. And hopefully we can make them die in really beautiful ways, not the way they're being forced to die under state, capital, medical, industrial complex. But how do when we decouple joy and sorrow, we take away what makes life so beautiful? The wistfulness. I'm looking out right now at the wistfulness of spring emerging, right? And there's something always bittersweet about spring, right? It's like we could say, oh, it's so beautiful. There's all these pretty flowers, and then it's wistful in a certain sense because other things are like leaving, and some things are coming. All seasons have that bittersweet quality of joy and sorrow. We're leaving behind some things and moving toward others, and yeah. So I don't know, maybe poetry captures that too.
No, I think it does. And I think, it's one of those strange things where I think you hit the nail on the head. People really want to either be happy or they want to be sad. There's no in between. It can't be both and. It has to be either or. And I think one of the crucial sort of animating dialectics of anarchism is this idea of it being both and, right? Of this sort of simultaneity, this idea that things are beautiful messes, to use your language, and that, joy wouldn't taste as sweet if it wasn't, not in this kind of, I guess, like self-deprecating way of like, oh, it's got to be painful for it to be good. Like, that's not what I'm saying. Like, but like, there's something about that quality that makes it so much sweeter. And I think that, the struggle of direct democracy in particular really highlights that, because there are so many losses, but there's also that absolute euphoric moment where you realize that you don't have the answers, but someone else sitting beside you does, and that you can participate in that together, and that it's not that they're more powerful or more intelligent or more articulate than you are. It's that they have a different life experience, or they have a different way of looking at the world, or whatever it might be, and that you guys get to share that together and make the world better. It's not either or, it's both and simultaneously.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is this idea of it being both and in the world today, because this anthology comes out in a really, I think, important time where we have to do a lot more imagining. I think that a lot of people are really cynical right now. They're suffering losses. They're seeing death and suffering and hardship and the pure naked avarice of capitalism in this country, and they're feeling paralyzed and powerless. And I think that part of that is because we lack the imagination to really push ahead and to look at things in different ways. And I wanted to ask you, you've been doing recent walkabouts on Instagram and using the hashtag fuck COVID-19 and doing these like walks, and it's been really interesting kind of reading through those posts, almost like photo essays or journal entries. And I was curious, like, why was it important for you to kind of do these daily walks and to document what you're seeing, and not only do it for yourself but to share it with others?
I mean, it's odd. I first sort of started doing those kind of picture essays when I was experiencing my dad got 8 years ago, got bitten by a mosquito and got West Nile, which is similar to this pandemic. It's a climate catastrophe caused disease, and then he was put into a horrible medical system that treated him really badly, and blah, blah, blah. And so my grief was so overwhelming, and I was so isolated because I went to take care of him, and I had no one around me. I was like me and basically him and my mom, who was also sick at the same time, and dying also. So I started doing that, and it was a weird way. I don't know why I even turned to that. I was just, maybe it's because I'm an outward person and I don't know. And maybe it was because I want to be in community so much. It's part of my cultural Judaism too. A diasporic people is like the category communities, like number one for me is like, we need each other. We can't do things alone. What you said, you can always turn to someone else and go, hey, you have right now, this moment in human history is so hard. I don't know if I hadn't thought of the cynical. I haven't heard of anyone saying they're cynical so much as just despair and depression and weariness and confusion, just like, we need each other. And so I think I started doing those, and I had so many people respond to that moment when I was writing about my own grief, but also it was a coping tool for me. It was my way of grieving and not losing myself, not losing, I was down to my bare self. I had nothing but me and taking care of people who were dying. And I think we're in this other moment, which is really intriguing. So many people, intriguing, that maybe is the wrong word, horrific. People are down. A lot of people right now are being scaled down to their bare selves. They don't have all the things that they shop for, or job and boss or coworker, all the things that normally, quote, define them. And we're down to who we are and what we notice about ourselves and what makes life inherently worthwhile, which I think it is. And capitalism tells us it isn't, but that's again my deep commitment to the forms of self-organization is everything has inherent worth, everything, And so how do we get to that? So I walk anyway as a form of keeping my mind body together and coping, and I notice and I look, and so I just started taking pictures of things every day that I see related to what's going on, and I don't even know where that I think the fuck I was, really. I still am. Grief is the dominant emotion for me of this time period. I was horribly depressed and grief-stricken for the first 3 weeks or so. And so I was like, fuck this. This isn't the life I want. This isn't where I want to be. I don't want all these losses. I don't want to have to lose things again. I don't want to have to start from scratch. I don't want to, right? But that's, maybe we have to do that. I don't want to. And then you get to, okay, but what do I want to do? Because this is the world I'm now in. And so I don't know, those walks for me are for me on one hand, and on the other hand, I get, I think I always understand the emotions I'm experiencing. I'm not unique. Everybody's experiencing grief and despair and sorrow and anger and occasional bursts of wow, we can do this. It's going to be okay. Maybe it'll go back to, blah, blah, blah. People are so great. People are so awful. So I think I'm doing it because I also want to convince myself, but I write as a form of inspiration, and I write as a form of political organizing, and I write as a form of intervention in things I don't like. And I don't want people to kill themselves at this moment because they feel despair. I don't want people to feel alone. I don't want anarchism and our own infrastructure and our own beautiful interrelationships to fall apart. I don't want so many things I don't want. I don't want fascism to arise in this space. So deciding for ourselves right now feels bittersweet. Can I celebrate a book right now? It feels hard. Usually I would be out there running around doing talks, sharing it. And I was like, no, I don't know, celebration's a weird word for it, but I know that book is like a gift to say, no, we have to focus on what promises there are, not some false hope, but what promises. So those walkabouts are, for me, some days I'll talk about how awful or sad I feel because I want people to be able to feel. I've seen a lot of people expressing through social media that they're not being told they should just be happy, or I see a lot of the signs when I walk around, which I don't post, are just like, be happy, everything will be all right, we'll get back to the way we were. I don't post those because I'm like, no, we won't. Maybe I will someday and write about how people can't just deal with I wish I saw signs in windows that said, I'm inside crying right now, I hope you're finding a space to cry too, or whatever, or it's hard, or things that are real, or some of us are in this together. Others of us are trying to just kill us all. What are the real signs we would see? But I think part of the reason I'm doing it is also because I'm seeing mutual aid. I walked by a little thing, I haven't posted it yesterday, a house I walk by every day, and they had a teeny little box outside with a very detailed sign, and they're hand making masks, and they were like, these are we smoke-free, pet-free, all cotton. We're trying to make as many as we can. If anyone can leave elastic, we could make more. Please just take, but we want people to have masks, which is totally just, I was like one person in their house, just putting out this teeny little cardboard dispensary of masks. I was like, oh, so I'm writing also to say, hey, you could do that too at your house, or you could get chalk and do things on the sidewalk, or you could, take a little, those little libraries in towns. There's a lot where I am right now.
There's a lot here too. Yeah.
Okay.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
There's only one that's been turned into like a food and hand sanitizer dispensary. And so I've been trying to encourage people to turn those into those things. But then I personally want little spaces outdoor for grieving. So last night I was like, hey, who could take one of those and turn those into a little outdoor grieving space for me? And someone said they would do it. So I'm going to work with them on that, hopefully. But I just partially the reason I'm doing that is to show, it's not enough, but there's, in our isolation, we can create social solidarity. We can create connection. We can create collective care. We can reach out to each other. So I do those little walkabouts to hopefully people start going, yeah, fuck this, fuck the system that's making us do this, and how beautiful we are. Because the other hashtags I always am obsessively using are social solidarity, collective care, mutual aid, we are all we have, we are all we need, and not falling into this like language of like, oh, it's a privilege to stay home, which to some it is for some people. For a lot of people, they're having emotional, and health collapses. Staying at home is a prison, and that's not a good place to be. Staying at home is being beaten by your partner. A lot of people are also still calling it social distancing, and I'm really depressed. All of us are. I'm staying with my sister yesterday. We both looked at each other at the same time. My sister said, I'm so missing just seeing a friend in real life. And I go, oh, I was just thinking that. We both started tearing up. And, there's something really visceral about it. I won't even go on audio Zoom because I don't want to give in. That's for me a line. I don't want to give in to that being my new world. I thrive on humans we are animals. We need physical human contact. We need real eyes to look into. We need real human bodies. We need that, So I don't know, even I can write about those little things in some of my posts. I like to try to question, like, what is it? Yeah, I don't know. It's just my form of writing right now. Sadly, I'm having trouble writing longer things, but that's okay, because I think the other thing for me is none of us are getting anything done, which is weird, which is part of grief. It's like everything seems sort of slowed down. Time's confusing. It's hard to finish things. Thank goodness this anthology came back 6 weeks ago from a printer that who knows if they're even printing anymore, got shipped to California, which is only allowing certain numbers of packages in, usually gets distributed. One place it gets distributed, which not desirable, but all books get distributed that way, is on Amazon. Amazon for a month is like, we're not sending books out, because they're not essential, as far as I understand, especially probably anarchist books. So also, it is this weird way in which, how do we, use whatever capacity we have, to do what we can do and not also feel like, I feel this way. I can't get done half of what I want to do or 3/4 of what I want to do, but I can do something. And my gift is walking around, noticing the world and taking pictures and writing little things, and people seem to respond to. Other people have gifts of cooking and making meals, and other people have the gift of, organizing mutual aid. Everyone has to say, what can I do to take care of other people right now, to take care of myself and other people? What can I do? Everybody, and those to me become the little tiny threads that we could then weave into the fabric of what might look like some of these examples and deciding for ourselves to come back to that, so, yeah. And to turn to that, I just was like, when you were talking about poetry, I was thinking about one piece in there on Rojava, which is by Dilar Durek, who I really was with me. There were only a couple people that I really reached out to write for, because I knew they were part of something they could write about. And I was like, oh, she'll never say yes. And then she was the first person that I reached out to, and she instantly said yes. And I was like, oh my God.
Yay, that's awesome.
But she's been doing beautiful writing about Rojava, and is Kurdish and spends time there. And she goes, I want to do it if you'll let me write about magic, because no one will let me write about magic. And I go, oh my God, okay, direct self-governance and magic and feminism and magic. And so, that piece is so beautiful, because she talks about, I just keep coming back to how even more relevant this anthology is than when I thought it would be relevant. She writes about like this the magic of capitalism and patriarchy that gets you to believe you need to be controlled and dominated and, beaten and commodified or instrumentalized. And she goes, and then there's the magic we make of feminism, that we look at each other and we say, nope, we know how to take care of each other. We know how to engage in forms of solidarity and decide our lives for each other. And that we need to, how do we break the spell of capitalism and move to the magic of feminism? And so she uses these pieces in it that are sort of fairy tale, magical folk tales that come out of, as I understand it, the tradition of sort of folk storytelling in her traditions, but they come out of her actual conversations with women that are part of struggling in Rojava for this incredible, remarkable experiment in a feminist form of self-governance. Probably one of the against fascism. It's like so striking, Rojava, for that reason. It's like feminism is so dominant and the values a pillar of it. And these stories are so beautiful because they're women talking about, finding their power to fly, to find the promise. And her title is "Only with You this broom will fly." Only together can we all get there, So I don't know. Tell your own story in whatever way you have, or do whatever you can. But I just think her piece, again, is another way of these little tiny stories that seem like nothing are actually everything.
100%. Yeah, that story in particular really stood out to me, and I really loved the way that it was framed and put together, and this sort of folklore magic. It was just great. It was awesome. I love it. One of the things that I also wanted to ask you about, just because I feel almost like it would be weird to do an entire discussion about the book and not ask you this, is, and I figure this is probably like asking a parent to like decide amongst their favorite children, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, do you have like a favorite story or an essay? Was there one that maybe like you had to work extra hard on during the editing process because of translations or something like that?
I feel like it worked, except there's one in Puerto Rico which I saw. I wanted one on a space that had been like destroyed by climate change, and writing about the kind of kernels of neighborhood assemblies that emerged out of that space, and saw that one somewhere else and had them rewrite it. But that one took the probably least work of any of them. But the rest of them all took probably equal amounts of a lot of work. But I don't know. I don't have favorites precisely because each of them I really didn't want overlaps. So when I knew, like when Delar was like going to write about the magic of feminism, and her piece is at first I wanted a piece on Rojava. I thought she was going to write about the nitty gritty of how the assemblies work in Rojava.
Right. Like the actual like function of the society.
Right. Which I have not seen a piece on, and I would love. But she's like, I don't want to write about that. I want to write about the magic of them. And I thought, okay. And then Scott Campbell, who I already know, who's contributed to Rebellious Morning and does really incredible translation from Spanish to English, and also does also beautiful writing. I was like, I know Scott will help me do an incredible piece. And Scott wrote the one on Tehran, and Scott put in the huge amount of work having to find people in Tehran, none of whom spoke English. Scott ended up doing a lot of translation back and forth, and even in the conversations recorded a lot of interviews with people. That piece I love because it's so nitty gritty detailed in the mechanics of how they do it.
It was so interesting. Yeah, for sure.
But that by itself, the two together make it better. They make it more my favorite is the fact that they're a constellation of pieces. And I guess the other ones I wanted to just sort of quickly gesture to, there's one in a space in Barcelona where people were fighting gentrification, and a piece about a 40 or 50-year-old space in Copenhagen, also in a space of high gentrification, highly, before COVID, tourist destination cities. And in those both places, just one was the Copenhagen one was people squatted and held onto it for 40, 50 years. So what happens when you squat a space and then they bought their whole neighborhood a few years ago, and they've been managing it for 40 or 50 years. There's 3 generations of people that live there. That is a different experience. The Barcelona one, which is a similar context, where it goes back to a neighborhood that during the Franco years, the Spanish Civil War, was an anarchist neighborhood that stood up longest against Franco and has a very anarchistic sensibility, but was slated for and was demolished. And it was a very horizontally, physically shaped space. So both those pieces get at, you need proximity, you need a physical space in which people can walk around and see each other and engage each other. Direct democracy isn't a meeting. It's hanging out, talking to each other. It's neighborly conversations. It's having someone come on the porch and yell at you when you do something instead of a cop coming at yelling at you when you do something, right? So there's different
ways. It's doing
ways.
Life together.
Yeah, and so I think those pieces are like, what does it look like in major cities? Greece, is also a bellwether in a certain way. Their economy collapsed before probably the U.S. economy is going to collapse, and people formed this incredible network of solidarity projects because capitalism was falling apart. And then there's pieces in there on Pan-African traditions of self-governance and Anishinaabe traditions of self-governance, and the one that's in indigenous territory in so-called Quebec, talks about looking at old ways of self-governance that go back thousands of years that are also very feminist and are based on stories and traditions of oral traditions. And so both those pieces are interview style, also as sort of as a homage to the fact that a lot of the traditions from forms of, slave self-organizing or ex-slave self-organizing to indigenous people's self-organizing were oral, and they didn't write them down. They didn't want people to know, or that's their own traditions. And so how do you capture that is through a dialogue, but those also say, maybe we need to restore and modify some of the things we've done for thousands of years. And the last thing I want to point to, because I really love, I maybe have missed one. I was trying to go through a lot of them because I was really trying to get at different things with each to show, there's no one, quote, right way. But one of the ones that I put at the very end, because I really do try to curate what you're left with, and maybe this piece touches my heart in a way that some of the other ones don't because of the process, which was behind the scenes. What is a piece on, I'm going to totally mispronounce it, Lentières, which means little lentil in French. I know I'm mispronouncing that. It's a place in Dijon, France, and some folks squatted in the middle of the city, big piece of land. It's many acres of land that used to be a little farmed and garden thing was vacant. And they squatted it 11 years ago, and it was all like French sort of anarchists squatting it, people that lived in that area. And they formed a bunch of little farms and gardens and little bike co-ops and, did events and all the things anarchists sort of do in spaces, which are lovely. And then there's a refugee crisis in Europe, and people didn't want to house refugees, or refugees squatted buildings, but then got brutally assaulted by cops or things like that. So more and more they started taking refugees into their space because it was their own self-determined space. They didn't have to ask permission, or, they were holding. And now their space, I think I'm really bad at remembering numbers, but I think it's something like 80% of the people that live there now are from other places, or came there as refugees. And there's only 20% now that are French anarchists. And a lot of the people that are refugees aren't anarchists. And I think there's 13 different languages spoken there from people from 11 different places. And so when I asked them to write that piece, they were the folks I found when I was trying to get someone to write about the Zod. I found this place. The person at that point said, well, I do want to write about that, but you have to understand it's a disaster. And I go, I really want someone to write about how, I don't want this to just be like, everything's great, because no system is perfect. We really need to talk about the truth of spaces. And so they wrote this piece that was so brutally, like, it's all the things that were going wrong because they were in the middle of it going wrong. And one of the things that was going wrong is just given 13 different languages, translation issues, hierarchies of different languages, some people liking process, some people not, and racism. They were experiencing and patriarchy. They were experiencing really profound dynamics around race and patriarchy. And it was about to fall apart. And so I get this piece that was just like, this is a mess. It's horrible. It's going to fall apart. And I was like, you're telling me this? This is what I was saying during the editing process. You're telling me this, but you're still there. I want you to tell me why you're still there too. And so that piece is so beautiful because it bookends why it started, what the impulses were, how it transformed, what the aspirations were, what their struggles are. And then it ends with, literally, I think the last line is, but we're still here. It ends with, and it's a year after when they first started writing it. So they actually did end up working through a lot. And they go, we have to work through these things. If we don't, and they said, what the reason we're still here is because we have a deep commitment to stay here and continue to work on these things. Unlike most societies that will just be like, we're not working on our white supremacy. We're just going to either, embolden the white supremacists or kill people of color and Jews and Muslims and, queers. And so the right answer is it's going to be hard, but we're going to stay there and be there for each other and care for each other and work through it in ways that are, and it's such a beautiful piece. It isn't acrimonious. And so I really want to end on that saying, even when we get to these moments that are hard, because one of the critiques of Occupy in the United States was it fell apart because of racism and patriarchy. It fell apart after a month or two because of so many reasons that this space had been going for 10 years and it was trying to deal with it. After a month, for us to take on the whole of patriarchy and racism, it's not going to work. That was not going to work in Occupy. And then there was the cops and a whole bunch of other reasons it wasn't going to work. But if we'd been able to hold those spaces for 8 or 9 or 10 years, I'm pretty sure we could have had a much better response to those dynamics. And so I really wanted to have a piece. And I really wanted to find someone who would be willing to write about that honestly, to say, we're still doing this in the world where there's still capitalism, there's still patriarchy, there's still fascism, there's still gentrification. All the pieces show that there's still all these things. And yet we can create spaces that are still dignified and loving and caring, and quality of life is remarkably better.
Yeah, I really love the way that you explain it as like a constellation of all these different stories, all these different examples of direct democracies interpolated and sort of intertwined in these different ways, and how it works in these different places and spaces, and how it can be a struggle, but how it can also be a triumph and a joy, and that like part of the struggle is the joy that comes from it. It's a beautiful mess, as it were.
Yeah. No, or not even just I guess I wanted to say not the joy, but the life. Like,
yeah,
people are creating life for themselves, and we all know what's happening right now, especially in the United States with COVID, is we're living in a society that wants to see most of us dead. It's so clear, right? And what does it feel like to live in a space where everybody wants to see people survive and thrive? That's a really different baseline.
Totally.
Like it isn't just joy, it's surviving and thriving. And we're in a society that wants to destroy and kill. And that's why it's so heartbreaking right now. So again, I really, I don't make any money on these books. I always point this out. I do these as my labor of love. I edit other books that are not anarchist for my livelihood. I do these completely because this is a form of political organizing. And I want it to be a gift. And, whatever way you get a copy, read it with 10 other people aloud. I don't, and I want AK to survive too. So buy it if you can, but gift it if you can to someone else. But I really want us. It's like it is really my intervention and a challenge right now. It's like I'm so scared. We're heading toward fascism, and I want us to head toward something else. I want us to head toward life.
Yeah. I want to head towards life as well. Yeah. That's a solid note to kind of end it on. But before I let you go, I do want to ask you about the decision to advocate for like this early release, because obviously you and I are recording this episode in the midst of COVID-19. There is a health crisis that has quickly led to the collapse of critical economic infrastructure here in this country where you and I both live. And I think it is really important to uplift like the voices and the work of AK Press. And I'm curious, like, why did you kind of advocate for this decision to push the book out early? And moreover, why is it that anarchist literature is important now than ever before?
Well, the book came back from the printer 6 weeks early, like pretty much the first day that it was clear we were all going to need to have these like shelter in place things. And like I said, the warehouse for AK is in California, and everyone was stunned. And so we're like, what do you do? It says the way the publishing industry works is it said April 21st is a publication date. And the whole publishing industry, which is run by a very small monopoly and you need to kind of conform to it, whether you're an anarchist publisher or not, if you want books out there, is you need to wait till that release date. And so, for a few weeks, we're like, okay, what do you do? And also everything's collapsing. And so I'm really glad that about 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, AK came up with this idea and asked, and I was like, yes, because I really wanted the book to be out. I was like so eager for it to be out. And unfortunately, just until April 21st, because I think this will come out on that day, AK did this thing, which was pay what you can, starting at basically 75% off the book, or pay it forward where you could pay to gift it so someone could get the book for free. And I think a lot of people, I hope, have been taking AK up on that. And that was meant to be solidarity for people who are don't have any funds right now, have lost jobs, can't pay rent, and also to get the book out there at the same time. But that is at the price where no one's making any money, barely paying for printing or mailing. But also I want to say is it was also a way to support AK and every radical publisher, every anarchist publisher, which is near and dear to my heart, but any radical publisher, radical or anarchist independent bookstores, social centers, spaces, or projects are all so fragile. We have no grants. We have no support. We're not nonprofits. We rely on each other. We decide for ourselves. We also fund for ourselves and make it work. And they're already all shoestring. And almost all of those spaces are having to like vastly scale back or shut down. And I really fear for how they will be able to open up again. So the challenge for publishing, which I don't think people even understand, is if Amazon won't distribute books, you could, to hell with it, but Amazon, a huge percentage of the books, whether we like it or not, go out that way. If huge percentages of bookstores are not open or end up going out of business, where do people get books? If the postal service gets canceled and there's some expensive thing put in its place, how do we, there's going to be all these structural reasons that it's going to be harder and harder to get books out. So I super want to encourage people now, if you're going to order books, do it directly from the radical publishers that you love. Support them directly because they will get more of the money to be able to survive. If you can become friends of those publishers to support them, do. Because if we don't have these around, to get to your second question afterward, is like the literature that's going to be out there is going to be, the fascists have lots of money, lots of resources. They own a lot of and or have big prominent voices on a lot of the mainstream giant platforms. We are a tiny, we have our little DIY ways of, we need these voices out there. We need to give people possibility. And so, like I said at the beginning of this, I had started this thing called Collective Care Directory. It's hosted on the Mutual Aid Disaster Relief website. I started the first day also out of grief, just because I was like, I need to remember that there are people doing mutual aid. And originally I had maybe a dozen or two little mutual aid projects, and now there's hundreds. And it's because they've all flowered. And so many people write to me and say, oh, I found one on there, and it made me feel like I could start my own. So I know the power of you have something out there in writing. People can read it and then they go, hey, I could do that too in real life. That's powerful. And if we don't have those, I don't want our whole lives to be online either. I don't want either something beautiful about holding print things in your hand and being able to hand it to people and put it in little libraries and stick it on the ground and give it away. And, zines and books are, if things get really bad and really authoritarian and we don't have access to online sources, we need print things we could share with each other, right? And reproduce cheaply. So all these many reasons, but anarchist literature, both fiction and nonfiction, is utterly essential right now for people to imagine. I really think we're at this crossroads. It's either fascism, anarchism, or ecocide. And we all have to pick one of those sides, or I would say fascism and ecocide are on the same side. So I really think we need to pick that side and to have, not everyone has to be an anarchist, but I so want those ethics. It's not that I so want them. I know they'll create this world in which everybody has a place in it and everybody gets to live and thrive. Like I said, survive and thrive. And that those ethics need to be out in the world as a compass, as a star, as a horizon, right?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Sydney, this has been, honestly, just a incandescent conversation. Long before you and I got to meet and conspire in Atlanta, I wanted to have you on the show, and I'm so glad that we got to make it happen. I say this with all of the sincerity I can muster. Your work is so fucking important to me and to so many of my friends and my comrades, and so I genuinely appreciate all the time and labor and love and the sorrow and also the joy that went into creating this anthology. If circumstances were different, I know you'd be out on tour right now and sharing this space and having these kinds of conversations with people all over the so-called United States. And unfortunately, because of the world that we live in right now, that can't happen. But I hope that this episode, such as it is, can help stimulate that experience for people and give them that kind of connection that they could have had otherwise. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show. Before we part ways, can you let listeners know where they can go to pick up a copy of Deciding for Ourselves?
Yep, I would say go to AK Press, which is akpress.org, or your local indie or anarchist or radical bookstore, because a lot of them are trying really hard to use DIY delivery or mail to survive right now. Yeah, and I want to thank you. My heart goes back out to you. I really feel so grateful and honored to be having this conversation with you, and hope so many other people can, take this podcast and use it as an example in their own community to have like conversations that are really thoughtful. I really appreciated your ability to do those kinds of conversations too, and put out the real world of people struggling toward a better society. So I hope this encourages other people to try as best as possible to have dialogues right now too, wherever you are. So thank you. Thank you. It was such a joy to be talking to you today.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, I love you so much. I appreciate you. I hope you have a great one. All right.
Okay. Same.
And that about does it for this week's episode of Coffee with Comrades. This is an entirely DIY show run by workers for workers. If you like what you hear, you can follow us on Twitter at CoffeeWComrades and Instagram at CoffeeWithComrades. Check out our website, www.coffeewithcomrades.com, and sign up to support our work with a monthly contribution by going to www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades. You can find Coffee with Comrades on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you go to get your anti-capitalist propaganda. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. While you're there, smashing that subscribe button, be sure to rate and review the show as well to help us increase our reach. If you have feedback, criticism, or you'd just like to get in touch with us, shoot us an email at coffeewithcomrades@gmail.com. Until next time, stay wild out there.
just want